Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are joining us from the world. My name is Matthew ten Bruggencate. I'm a communications manager at the International Institute for Sustainable Development. Welcome to the High Level Political Forum 2023 Debrief. We're just going to let people join the webinar and file in, but thank you so much for joining us. We're very fortunate to be joined by some excellent panelists and looking forward as well to your reflections in the chat. The chat window is open now, so please introduce yourself. And if you have any observations, feel free to share them there. We will share the chat log afterwards if you registered, as well as the video recording. This is being recorded and we'll share that in an email to everyone who attended. We ask you to keep the chat respectful, of course, respecting everyone's position from different parts of the world. As well, there will be a Q&A function. You should see that at the bottom of your Zoom window in the middle. If you have any questions for the panelists that you want them to answer at the very end, please drop them there. You can also look at the questions that other people have posed, and if you like them, vote them up, and we will see that they are rising to the top. I think that's it for the housekeeping. So it's my great pleasure to introduce Lynn Wagner, Senior Director for the Tracking Progress Program at the International Institute for Sustainable Development. Lynn.
Hi, and welcome. We're really glad that you're here and look forward to this discussion in the next hour. We wanted to start with a quick poll to find out who's in the room. So if you see some questions coming in front of you, please answer. All right. We have the results from that. Which regions are joining us and which HLPFs events did you participate in? Do we have some?
I appreciate some people are just joining us and giving their answers, but we will cap it off with the first 100 people who managed to answer.
Great.
And you should see the results now on your screen.
Yeah. So welcome and thank you for staying up so late to those in Asia. And joining us at the end of your day in Africa and Europe. It's pretty early in the in Latin America and the Caribbean and North America. Thank you for waking up and joining us. And then let's see which events did you participate in? I guess a good mixture of the official events and side events and the special events. There were quite a few special events this time, and great to see your optimism, especially just a few days after such an intense meeting, and I think justified that there is a lot of concern in the room. Look forward to discussing that with you this week, and then the SDG Summit. Quite a few planning to go. Those who are not, hopefully you'll be watching it from afar and seeing what happens at this in this unusual year, or every 4 years we have essentially 2 HLPFs, the one under ECOSOC auspices, which just concluded, and then the one that'll be under UNGA auspices. So welcome. Thank you for joining us. And on to, I guess we have to start just a few details on some numbers for the HLPF. Can you put that slide up? There we go. So the numbers. HLPF is mandated to meet for 8 days, so that's not a surprise. There were 5 SDGs under review. The first time around, there were more SDGs reviewed each HLPF. This one, it was 5 on SDG 6 on water, SDG 7 clean energy, SDG 11 on cities, SDG 9 innovation, and then SDG 17, which is on partnerships, which is always reviewed. Some numbers we got from DESA, that there were over 130 speakers, including experts, high-level government officials, 20 youth speakers, over 800 major groups and NGO representatives attended. There were over 180 delegations intervened in the general debate, including 85 heads of government, ministers, vice ministers, and ministerial level officials. There were 204 side events, and that included both in-person and virtual side events, 21 on-site exhibitions, 12 high-level special events, and 16 VNR labs, and with 38 presentations of VNRs, and the EU presented the first supranational VNR ever to be presented. So it was a very, very filled 8 days. Definitely, even though last year was back in person after the pandemic, it was more of a last minute decision to do it that way. So while it was in person, there wasn't quite the same buzz and level of activity at UN headquarters. This year, you could really feel that it was in person, that there were a lot of people there who really wanted to have those in-person conversations, a lot of follow-up, as I'll note, especially on a number of the SDGs under reviewed. There had been a lot of events and activities leading into this HLPF that the delegates were following up on. So what did they say during all these days? Overall, there was this sports analogy at the beginning, and it didn't carry through, I think, through the whole week, but they're talking about, how we're at halftime for the SDGs. And so far, we're pretty far behind, which is not really what your sports team wants to hear in that locker room at halftime. But, sometimes with the right pep talk, with the right rest, with the right feeling of maybe being behind and that we really have to bear down and do this, many games often are won in that second half. So we laid some groundwork during the first half, but now we really need to bear down and get these SDGs implemented. With the voluntary national reviews, many often say it's better to think of it as like a movie reel rather than a snapshot, that VNR presentation is just kind of the tip of the iceberg, and that it's everything that goes into it, the consultations, the preparation, and then what comes after it. How is the country changing or moving on after the VNR, or are they just putting it on the shelf? And it's that movie reel, that continuity that you really want to look at. Well, with the SDGs under review, you could think of it in the same way. So this was the kind of presentation, the second in-depth review for these SDGs. And so they've been learning from what had happened before, and then there were some intervening really high-level events for a number of these SDGs, and so the discussions in New York picked up from that point as well, from those high-level events. The SDG 6 and 7, water and energy in particular, the custodians had come together, had prepared these reviews of implementation. There had been high-level events in the intervening years since the last review of these SDGs, the high-level dialogue on energy for SDG 7, and the UN 2023 water conference for SDG 6. And so the discussions really were trying to capitalize on the momentum and the progress since those intervening, those high-level events, and also looking forward to how to position the discussion on those issues going forward, particularly in the ministerial declaration that we'll hear about in a little bit, that's going to be adopted at the SDG Summit, and then even further after that. But so these conversations you could really think of as this continuity and thinking, looking at the intervening events and where are the next opportunities to push this process forward. So as I said, on SDG 7, there was a very thorough assessment of progress, showed that only 15% of the accessible SDG 7 targets are on track. And that was a pretty similar assessment for the SDGs as a whole. For SDG 7, concern about progress or lack thereof, especially on clean cooking stoves. And starting to get kind of numbers of, if we don't do anything, this is how we're going to fall short in 2030. So 71% of the global population has access to clean cooking in 2021, which is great, 71%, but that leaves 2.3 billion people without access. And if we stay on the same pace, we learned that some 1.9 billion will still lack access to clean cooking in 2030. So, is that where we want to be when we get to 2030, or is there something we can do to accelerate the path? Growth in number of people with access to energy was shown, but still not enough to achieve the SDG targets. On current path, we expect only 92% will have energy access by 2030. And so to get to the SDG objectives, we need to double the pace for energy access from this year onward. And one other thing that also with regard to SDG 7, the high-level dialogue on energy several years ago, part of the outcome from that were the energy compacts, which are voluntary agreements, decisions, or commitments to take action to develop new partnerships. And so those still are really figuring prominently in the conversations around SDG 7. And prior to the SDG Summit in September, they're going to be recognized as one of the high impact initiatives that is going to be discussed as possible game changers or ways to move forward. So on SDG 7, there is just this whole integrated conversation of not just SDG 7 itself, but the conversations and commitments that have come up around it. Likewise with SDG 6 on water, the data from the progress report was rather sobering. The transboundary issues came up quite a bit. Only 24 countries of 153 countries that share rivers, lakes, and aquifers have that shared water covered by transboundary cooperation agreements. And it's important because if you have those agreements, then if there's a conflict, if there's a drought, if there's anything that comes up, you have that platform, that mechanism to have those conversations too, and you have a way to begin developing trust. And as one donor country noted, that this trust can also lead to the funding that is needed to manage those water sources. To emphasize that point, during the HLPF, during a side event on, or special event on water, there was a treaty ceremony during which the Gambia submitted its accession documents to the 2 UN water conventions. So this was going on in conference room 5 while HLPF was going on. Um, the SDG 6 discussions, as I said, have also moved forward. In 2020, during the pandemic, the SDG 6 acceleration framework was launched. This is looking at 5 key cross-cutting themes, really, and bearing down and focusing on national level action on financing, data and information, capacity development, innovation, and governance. And so there's this acceleration framework going on for SDG 6. And at the same time, it's gotten a big boost from the March meeting of the UN 2023 Water Conference. And as part of that, approximately 830 countries, organizations, other entities submitted commitments to what is called the Water Action Agenda. And so there were discussions about that Water Action Agenda, how that can move forward. And in the special event on water, there was also some, political messaging going on. So during the water conference, there was a proposal to have a special UN envoy on water. And so there were several countries during the special event stressing the need to have that person appointed. Some said they wanted it appointed before the SDG summit. One country even said that they were willing to support this envoy financially, so that there was this messaging. Just a few other things on water. There was support to convene regular intergovernmental meetings on water. We had just gone, 40-something years without an intergovernmental meeting on water. And so a lot of momentum to not wait that long again, and then also to develop a UN system-wide strategy on water. And so just a final note, bringing in 2 other the special side events. So there's been a lot of integrated or work on the specific SDGs that were under review. There's also this process called the SDG Climate Synergies series of meetings co-hosted by UNDESA and the UNFCCC Secretariat, the Climate Change Secretariat. This meeting was brought into the HLPF, so it met on the Sunday in between the 2 weeks of HLPF. There was a full conference room on this full Sunday of discussions. And the that meeting's kind of getting to the heart of the SDGs, that while there's all this activity on individual SDGs, we really need to bring it together and have this integrated action. Some of the conclusions from that meeting, I think, reflected conclusions from throughout the week of needing to deepen the evidence base and analytical work related to synergies and trade-offs across sectors, taking into account the existing inequalities when making decisions, strengthening multi-stakeholder cooperation and dialogue. The inclusive dialogue was really mentioned at all levels in I think every conversation I heard. And I think one other takeaway from another side event or special event was Science Day. So it was the first time that there was ever a Science Day during HLPF. And one of the takeaways from that was to remember the importance of knowledge brokers. And those are the people who are helping to bring together the data and the evidence with the policymakers who need to understand it. And in many ways, all of us are knowledge brokers. We are bringing information and providing evidence to decision makers at all levels of our life and all levels of decision making. And so, what can we do to ensure that we are providing the best evidence and choices for decision makers? And so with that, I'm really looking forward to this kind of companion presentation. Javier Surasky, from the research director from CEPEI, is going to introduce civil society observations. He has taught international cooperation courses at different postgraduate courses in Latin America and European universities. Coordinates the governance for development unit at CEPEI. And IISD has had the great pleasure of collaborating with CEPEI and specifically with Javier for several years to convene these pre and post HLPF briefings. So I'm really pleased to invite him now to offer his remarks.
Thank you, Lynn. Thank you very much. It's my pleasure to be here. And I thank all the panelists that joined us, and of course, to all the participants that give sense to this webinar. So to be brief, to understand the 2023 HLPF, it is key to have in mind that it worked under the shadow of the SDG Summit. Therefore, any decision and possible action to be taken was more or less deferred to the summit. Considering the experience of 2019, when we also have HLPF meetings under the ECOSOC and the General Assembly, I'm not sure, I should say, that these years with 2 HLPF are providing any important outcome in the first HLPF meeting. So I think that it will be necessary to rethink this logic of having 2 HLPF at the same year. And even the Secretary General and the Deputy Secretary General participation in this HLPF was almost 0. It shows that also to the UN, the main issue this year is the summit and not this ministerial meeting. However, in focusing on the 2023 HLPF that just finished, it is possible to identify some remarkable moments. For example, the first ever HLPF session on middle-income countries, and the first ever Science Day that Lynn just mentioned are important if they have continuity in future HLPF sessions. If this one just a one-shot session, then it won't be really a contribution to the SDGs implementation. And I think that it is also important to highlight that every panel this year for the first time included at least one representative of the youth. Regarding the thematic SDGs under debate, we can highlight some strengths, but also some concerns. On SDG 17, in-depth analysis sessions followed an interesting path. They started with a debate on financing for development, presented as a warm-up from the high-level dialogue on financing for development that will take place in the fall, followed by a session in which previously published report guided the debates. The special edition of the Secretary General report on progress towards the SDGs and the 2023 Global Sustainable Development Report entitled Learning from SDI Forum Promoting Partnership on SDI and Transformation for the SDGs. Those reports provided the debates with data and information that help to have useful debates. Similarly, the discussion on SDG 6 on clean water was introduced as a follow-up of the UN 2023 Water Conference and Water Action Agenda, and expert inputs coming from the UN Water SDG 6 Synthesis Report 2023, the second of its kinds, provided also concrete policy recommendations that informed the discussions. On SDG 11 on sustainable cities, in-depth analysis helped to make the local level one of the main stars of this year's HLPF. Many sessions focused on understanding and improving the work that is being done at the local level. Moreover, the critical importance of local level engagement in the 2030 Agenda implementation was a cross-cutting issue bubbling up in almost every session of the HLPF. Nevertheless, there were no presentation of VLRs, voluntary local reviews, during this HLPF, making a clear contradiction between the discussion and the facts. On SDG 7 on affordable and clean energy, the inclusion in this year HLPF, I think, was a mistake. It would be more helpful to analyze it in 2025 or 2026. Let me remind you that back in 2021, the high-level dialogue on energy resulted in the global roadmap for accelerated SDG 7 action that included two sets of milestones for 2025 and for 2030. So the HLPF will be a proper place to debate those milestone achievements, but this year was too early. On SDG 6, on industrialization, innovation, and infrastructure, it is hard to understand why debates are not paying more attention to artificial intelligence. After hearing the debates, I feel we are discussing an industrialization model that is fading away instead of preparing for the future to come. And it is not an innovative nor a sustainable plan of action. On a different note, the HLPF continues to leave the regions behind. Sustainable Development Regional Forums do not have enough space to present their contributions to the HLPF, making the reporting and monitoring multi-level chain more and more weaker. I won't go into VNR's discussions or links with future summit issues because we have here experts to consider those issues in depth. Still, I cannot help but mention the first ever presentation of what we in CEPEI names as a VR, Voluntary International Entity Report, submitted by the European Union as an interesting and promising innovation. So let me finish my presentation with three main takeaways from these HLPF sessions. First, the 2023 HLPF lost unique opportunities to go a step further on the 2030 Agenda integrated analysis. Half of these year VNRs were presented by high-income countries, providing a missed opportunity for a more substantial debate on the actual means of the principle of universality of the SDGs, including in the 2030 Agenda, and for a more intensive policy coherence discussion on the 2030 Agenda implementation. None of these issues were under debate. Second, this year marks the 75th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the first UN special mission, and the first peace operation deployed by the organization. It provided a vast chance to reinform the links between the SDGs implementation and monitoring, human rights, and peace, and it was also lost. Third, and the most important, it is urgent to have a more action-oriented HLPF leading the SDGs acceleration in a concrete way. If we want to have an opportunity to successfully confront the multiple crises hitting us and forge a sustainable future, the HLPF should change its ways of work to provide more concrete suggestions of work, a more intensive political guide to the process, and above all, a more action-oriented results that really helps countries and other stakeholders to take the next steps we need to move ahead and accelerate our path to the SDGs achievement. So thank you. I hope I can meet you again very soon to continue this discussion. The General Assembly is almost here, the SDG Summit also, and there will be, of course, a lot of new things to discuss and to think together, because the 2030 Agenda, and it is becoming very, very clear, it's so important to left it only on the hands of the states. So it depends, still depends on all of us if it will have any opportunity to succeed, or we will meet in 2030 to review why we didn't move forward better and in more concrete ways. So thank you, and ready to discuss any of those issues with you.
Thank you so much. Now I'm pleased to introduce Sakiko Fukuda-Parr, the chair of the Committee on Development Policy and also a professor of international affairs at the New School in New York, to discuss the VNRs that were presented. Sakiko Fukuda-Parr contributes actively to international policy and research processes, and is focused particularly on human rights and development, global health, and global goal setting and governance by indicators. So over to you.
It seems that the host has to put my video on. Could the host put my video on? I tried to put my video on, but it tells me that the host has shut me out, so.
Just trying to resolve that.
Thank you.
You should see a prompt on screen to start your video.
I have it now. Yes. Thank you very much. And first of all, thank you so much for the invitation to participate here. And I just want to say that as somebody who isn't part of an organization and that doesn't have a massive bandwidth in terms of monitoring what's happening, this session is really very, very helpful in understanding the trends and some of the key issues that we're dealing with. The main concern that I have, takeaway that I have perhaps from this HLPF is that is a sort of a disconnect between an extremely strong statement in the Secretary General's report about the sorry state of progress overall, that there's this global perspective of, the need for a rescue plan. But the message of the need for a rescue plan, it just doesn't seem to get reflected in with the same kind of urgency and global perspective, the need for a game-changing new strategy for implementation. And I think that's the general feeling. And of course, in many of these sessions that you have also talked about, there were all kinds of initiatives being taken, particularly at the local level and so forth. But somehow I think that the problem with the SDGs is that all of these micro initiatives, whether they're at the micro local initiative, whether they're at the micro level of one particular target or a goal, don't add up. So it's the sum of the parts don't add up to global progress. And what is shatteringly distressing is the fact that so many of the goals are actually going backwards. And that there is a real need. And I just wonder to what extent the need for that urgent rebooting is really being felt. And of course, these comments come particularly from my perspective of having focused on the national VNRs that absolutely don't take on board this message of the need for a rescue plan, the need for a need for a game-changing strategy change. And here and there are some comments, for example, about the nature of private-public partnerships. But that's not something that there has been raised as a major concern from what I have been able to make out. Many of, at the same time, I think, for example, some of what Javier just mentioned, the importance of the local level. Yes, I mean, I think it's a fantastic thing. And I think it is really that I get this sense that the vibrancy of SDG implementation is at this sort of micro local levels. Because as I mentioned, where does that all of that sort of add up to making some significant systemic changes? At the same time, the Secretary General is actually making very interesting comments about the need for a new international global architecture, financial architecture. He's making all kinds of important comments about the need for a different kind of workout mechanism for debt. I realize that HLPF may not be considered to be the right forum for discussing some of these international finance issues, but it was also, in a way, interesting that the national, local, also the non-governmental interventions don't necessarily focus on the need to resolve these global macro issues, without which major progress in SDG implementation cannot be made. I think also, so therefore I feel that there is this disconnect between the macro and the micro, the global and the local, and the national and the intergovernmental, global. And in that sense, I think obviously goal 17 and any limitations of goal 17 is something that deserves much more attention and much more emphasis. As many of you on the panel also know, we have been doing an analysis of the VNRs over the last several years, and have basically come to the conclusion that the VNRs lack analytical content and are not the kind of documents that provide a basis for national governments and the other stakeholders at the national and local levels to reflect on the lessons of experience in terms of positive experience and lessons of where there have been gaps or failures. And this process of reflection just doesn't seem to be there in most national VNRs processes, although I do understand that what is written on paper is not necessarily a total reflection of the debates that are going on within the country. But in as much as the countries themselves are not prepared to come and say, this is a reflection that we have had, and therefore that we have to learn from experience and shift some of our strategies or rethink some of our strategies, I don't think we will get any kind of a game-changing plan to rescue the SDGs. I think also the fact that none of the SDGs, none of the VNRs seem to do a backward loop of reflecting on the difference between the first VNR that they had presented and then the second time round, I think is a major issue. So I think what we need is to move for next year's HLPF review to ask for a new approach to VNRs. I know Javier calls it version 3 and we've called it version 2. It really doesn't matter what we call it, but it's a new version of VNR concept, which we need to push for. And there again, I feel that there's this gap between the macro analysis that says that we're in trouble, and in fact, the many of the work of the UN agencies and bodies that are supporting the VNRs, that I don't see them saying that. I don't see them carrying those messages, whether they're in the regional commissions or whether they're in organizations like UNDP, country offices particularly. I think the message, this macro message of the global setbacks can't be just put on the backs of, oh, well, we have the pandemic and the war in Ukraine. It has to come down to the national conversations. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And now I'm pleased to turn it over to our final speaker to discuss this elephant in the room during HLPF, the SDG Summit, and then the Summit of the Future. Marianne Beisheim from SWP, the German Institute for International and Security Affairs, is an expert on follow-up and review processes in the UN's 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. And among other things, she's a member of the UN Political Advisory Board of the German Federal Foreign Office, of the Leadership Council of SDSN Germany, and the Research Council of the UN Association in Germany. So pleased to turn it over to you.
Thank you very much, Lynn, and also from my side, thanks for the kind invitation. You asked me to comment on the HLPF process, the implications for the SDG Summit and also next year's Summit of the Future, and then as well next year the review of the format and organizational aspects of the HLPF. That is quite a task, so sorry for rushing through all this. I think we have already heard the key words, the key messages that came out of the 2023 HLPF. That is the rescue plan and the acceleration in going forward, achieving the goals and targets by 2030. And the president of the General Assembly said something that I found very convincing. He said, the good news is that we are still in the game, but now we need to change the game. And this is pointing us towards the systemic change that is needed, that was already discussed a bit in the chat and also by the two previous speakers. And this is also the message of the Global Sustainable Development Report, the GSDR, the scientific report, that we need to focus on the capacities, the knowledge and the skills to manage the transformation that is coming anyway, and the president of the General Assembly said it various times during the HLPF, we have to master this transformation or we'll have to endure it. Now, what are the implications for the SDG Summit? We hope to see a political declaration that is the official outcome document of the SDG Summit, and it will be adopted, or hopefully will be adopted, at the beginning of the SDG Summit by heads of state and government. And I put the current draft in the chat. It has three parts, this current draft. The first one is about this recommitting to the 2030 agenda and SDGs. The second part is about the midterm review, the sad state of affairs, as Sakiko has put it. The progress, the gaps, and the challenges. And the third part is, of course, the crucial part. It's the call to action, and it gives the commitments of member states a bit along the various goals, and also has a large part on the means of implementation. And that part, compared to the previous declaration, is somewhat more detailed, and also you could say somewhat more ambitious, but still it's not the kind of decisions on transformative actions that Javier was calling for. So last week, the two co-facilitators of this process on negotiating the political declaration, the permanent representatives of Ireland and Qatar, put this draft under the so-called silence procedure, hoping that this will find consensus. But yesterday they said the silence has been broken by a number of delegations, and they still think this draft is the best basis for consensus, and handed the current draft to the President of the General Assembly, who now pleads to member states to join or find consensus and reconsider whether they are willing to go with this current draft of the political declaration. So we'll have to wait and see what happens next. During the HLPF, we also heard the so-called general debate in the ministerial segment of the HLPF, so the last 3 days. And the title of this general debate was Building Momentum Towards the SDG Summit, and we could also say building political will, as has been discussed in the chat. So it's all about mobilizing the heads of national delegations who speak in this general debate, so that the leaders, the heads of state and government in September, bring the kind of national and global commitments that are needed to rescue the SDGs. And this again also relates back to the GSDR, the Global Sustainable Development Report, who recommended to member states to develop national plans on accelerated and transformative action. And that language is also in the political declaration. So we also know by now what will happen in September, because the Secretary General and the President of the General Assembly put online the draft program for the summit, and we'll hear 6 leaders' dialogues on scaling up actions, building resilience, the STI, science, technology, innovation as game changers, strengthening integrated policies and public institutions, and also the multilateral system. And last but definitely not least, mobilizing finance and investments. So these are the 6 leaders' dialogues, and in that context, these leaders are invited to present their national and global commitments. Part of the global commitments is also what Lynn in the beginning called the so-called high impact initiatives. This is something that the UN itself has developed. The United Nations Development System seeks to rally all actors behind a set of so-called high impact initiatives. That is UN collective action on 6 SDG transitions. Can't name them all, but digital public infrastructure, for example, is one of them. And 5 enablers. This is basically means of implementations, including the SDG stimulus, that's finance, and SDG localization, a push in that area, plus also the cross-cutting priority of gender equality. So those are the plans for the summit in September, the SDG summit. And some of these issues will be taken up again also next year, or this year, hopefully going on next year, in the process towards the so-called Summit of the Future in September 2024. There, in this process, the co-facilitators also suggested the general layout of the outcome document, the so-called Pact for the Future, should contain 4 chapters. The first one will be on SDGs and financing, the second one on peace and security, the third one on digital cooperation, and the fourth one on transforming global governance for the future. And that includes, again, a reform of the international financial architecture, a framework to progress beyond GDP, and the strengthening of the global governance of the environment and others. In the ongoing negotiations towards that summit next year, we see the same conflicts showing up during the consultations. But nevertheless, in my view, the twin summits, these two summits, open a window of opportunity for a package deal and to identify and set the right incentives for accelerated implementation, because we might see this this combination of a thorough review of countries' implementation strategies and revised plans for then accelerated action, plus maybe more effective methods of follow-up and review, plus the enabling multilateral environment and the financial and policy space that developing countries need to achieve the SDGs. So that could be a way forward. Next year, we'll also see the so-called review of the high-level political forum as a forum itself. The current draft, at least, of the political declaration confirms in one of the last paras that member states commit to use this review next spring to further strengthen the follow-up and review of the implementation of the 2030 agenda. And while the text does not mention the VNRs, I would think that actually in spring 2024, member states building on the outcome of the SDG summit could decide to mandate the VNRs for the next 4-year cycle of annual HLPF meetings to review these national plans for transformative and accelerated actions that are mentioned in the political declaration. And member states could also commit to do this a bit more vigorously, as suggested by Sakiko and also by the UNSG, by the Secretary General himself in his SDG progress report, where he asks member states to be more systematic, use more independent evaluations, also involve scientists in monitoring and review, and also civil society. In the past, however, in the last review, many member states have rejected any hardening of the VNR. So again, we will have to see, or rather have to build political will for going forward, not only this year, but also next year. Thank you.
Thank you. And now I think we might have time for a question from the group. I think Eleonora and Matt, do you have a suggestion for that?
I do, and if I could ask the panelists to please turn their cameras back on. As well as the SDG Summit, of course, we have COP28 on the horizon and on people's minds. And there is a question about loss and damages, about that issue, which is very prominent in the UNFCCC process. And someone asking climate-led disasters and their impact on human rights of mountainous countries like Nepal and vulnerable people, just as background, is what's on their mind. What progress on loss and damages could be possible in the September summit based on the efforts made so far? So perhaps we can. I want to do justice to this person asking this question. What do you think could be the connections between the SDG summit and the climate process? Thinking especially about how loss and damages has been so prominent in that discussion about how to get the financing, in particular, for loss and damages going. Does anybody have any thoughts of connections between the climate process and the SDG summit, and specific to loss and damages?
If you want, I can say a few things on this issue. Sadly, I should start by saying that I am not so optimistic on what will happen regarding specifically the issue of loss and damages on the SDG summit. As we all know, we are going through an environmental crisis, and the links between the SDG and the environment are more or less considered in every international meeting in which we discuss the SDGs. But it is also important to say, to have the complete picture towards the SDG summit in this particular issue, that the main issue that is blocking the adoption of the political declaration is related to financing. That is the paragraph that was the cause of many countries breaking the silence. And the loss and damages issue is close, very, very close to the financing issues. It seems that there is still no willing or a complete understanding on how the discussion of loss and damages is necessary, and find commonly agreed solutions on loss and damages is necessary to have a chance to accelerate the SDGs. So I wish I can give you more details or more optimistic information, but I think that the loss and damages issue is still far from have a concrete solution, a multilateral concrete solution, and I'm so worried about it.
Marianne?
If I may add just shortly, to give you also an impression what this political declaration looks like. Actually, it says in the political declaration, and I quote, "We will take concrete steps towards the operationalization of the new funding arrangements for responding to loss and damage by COP28. But that's it. They don't say, you know, what exactly they will do. They just announce that they want to go forward with this, without saying, you know, what's the level of ambition or what kind of finance will be mobilized. So, yeah. And even that seems to be too much.
Mm-hmm.
We are coming, my apologies. We are coming towards the end of time, and I appreciate this final question that I'd love to ask each of the panelists is opening a big can of worms. But it's a big can of worms that I think everybody is talking about, reflecting on being at the halfway point of the 2030 agenda and what could come after that. What would happen to the SDGs post 2030? And I guess I'm interested to know, as a final thought, whether or not you think it's too early to be having that conversation, what your thoughts are on people starting to reflect of, you know, how do we save things in the next 7 years? Or if you have any postulations about that question of where do the SDGs go after 2030, especially, you know, given the current trajectory that we see. So I know this was being talked about at the HLPF, and I'm curious for your thoughts if we're too soon to talk about this, or if this is indeed a question that needs answers now. And I open the floor to anyone.
I can start by saying that I'm not a big fan of this discussion. I personally think it's too early because it distracts us from what we need to do now. And that is, as we have discussed during the HLPF, rescue the agenda and go forward by accelerating action. And, you know, delegations and diplomats in New York, they love to discuss new goals and targets, because then nobody has to discuss how we are failing to achieve those that we have already agreed. And that's sort of what happened when the MDGs were still, you know, going to be implemented, but we already had started to discuss the SDGs and the so-called post-2015 agenda. So what I would like to see is now a focus on acceleration, and we'll have, you know, the Summit of the Future next year, then in 2025, the Social Summit, probably the 5th conference on FFD. There are so many things are happening that will lead us towards that point, and I think it's really way too early. We are already talking about things that complement the 2030 agenda, and let's, you know, slowly move there and see what happens.
If I may interject a couple of thoughts here, I make a comparison with what happened in the MDGs. And I remember that the MDGs, the post-2015 debate, were officially kind of suppressed, so to speak, by the SG, and then were opened rather specifically and deliberately in 2011 or 2012. And this led to a very intense set of global conversations for 2.5 years or so. And I personally, in that context, was very eager to start a conversation about the post-2015, simply because I really thought that the MDG framework was a total mistake because it was so narrow. In this case, I don't feel that the SDG framework is a total mistake. I would really like to focus on implementation. And I agree with Marianne that it is very distracting. And it's also distracting as a kind of a backhanded attack on the ambition of the SDGs. And I think that's one thing to sort of consider in the context of sort of like the political economy of global debates about global priorities. I think maybe that the Secretary General might weigh in some way to sort of say, well, we should only start discussing the global, the post-2030, starting in whatever it would be, the equivalent for the MDG, from the equivalent to the what happened in the MDG era would be something like, well, 2026 or 27 or something like that.
Well, I totally agree with both in the sense that it's too early to start discussing the framework to have after the SDGs. But just in a minute, and I think that it's also a good way to provide at least a general answer to Camilo, Jan, Christian, and Jackie. I invite you to think in the current process of accelerating the SDGs as a way to prepare the post-2030 agenda, because the post-2030 agenda will depart from the situation, the framework, and the progress that we could make in the years to come. So in the discussion of accelerating the agenda, we are discussing on how are we financing the gaps to implement the current SDGs. We are discussing on how to improve the governance of the process, and that means to include all kinds of stakeholders that should be there: local governance, of course, local governments, of course, local communities. But what about the parliaments, for example? What about the judicial power that should be part of these discussions? And when we think about issues like gender, maybe one of the main gaps in the 2030 agenda, at least in my personal opinion, is that we need to include the fourth variable of sustainable development, that is the cultural one. A couple of days ago, a report was published presenting as a result that 9 in 10 males have bias against women in the world. 9 in 10. So we need to include these cultural issues to solve many of the problems that we have now, because it also includes the cultural way in which we engage with nature. Let's start changing the things now, and then we will be ready to have an improved framework after 2030. We don't need to discuss the future framework. We need to act now to have a better opportunity to have a stronger outcome in 2030.
And on that note, thank you so much, all of you, for joining. Thank you very much to the panelists for sharing your insights. This year, although maybe the SDG Summit was a distraction during the HLPF, it means that in two or so months, we have the opportunity to dig down and push these issues forward once again. We don't have to wait till next July. So good luck in the coming coming weeks. Stay in touch and look forward to seeing how things progress in the coming months.